Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Hacking the Open Source Business podcast. I am one of the co-hosts, Matt Yankovic, and I'm here with Avi Press, my other co-host. And today we're joined by two gentlemen from Heroic Labs, Chris and Gabe. Chris, Gabe, how are you two doing today? Yeah. Why don't we start with Gabe? Gabe, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. What you do at Heroic Labs, and maybe give us the little overview of what Heroic Labs is.
Sure. For the overview of Heroic Labs, I think you probably want to go with Chris. He's been there from the beginning. I've been with Heroic about a year and a half at this point. I'm now the head of developer relations. I started out as a technical writer. So basically, I manage both our developer-related content and our community initiatives.
Awesome. And Chris, maybe if you could give us that overview of Heroic Labs and
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm one of the co-founders and engineers at Heroic. We have been in the industry about 7 years. We put together a collection of pieces of game tech tooling, mostly orientated on server tech, that helps game studios build and publishers build social, competitive, and real-time games. And we've been doing that through a mixture of open source and some of our history that we might go over together today before we went open source.
Okay. And so, when you talk about like that, those kind of core game components, can you give maybe a couple examples of things that you help with there? Like, it'd be really interesting. I'm curious.
Okay, absolutely. So if you think about a game tech stack that every studio wants to achieve, typically you could kind of carve it into a few major components. You've got everything that goes into the core gameplay, and sometimes what we call the meta gameplay. And those are the things that might be social features, friends, guild systems, leaderboards. It could be competitive stuff like matchmaking, multiplayer, asynchronous matching logic for, discovering opponents, for ghosting and other APIs like that. And then finally, it can be your core capabilities around social sign-in, user accounts, cloud save, everything that allows a game to be server-based. That's one piece of it. The next piece that goes into that game stack is what we call Liveops. And that's a collection of tooling that enables you to do analytics on the game, do experimentation, generate audiences so that you can do targeting and therefore do segmentation on the player base, running live events, so creating some kind of content cadence for players, maybe seasonal events like Christmas and Easter, and weekly and monthly events that might be what you call these days the season pass or the battle pass. That's another piece of it. But there's overall within that game stack, there's 3, 4, 5 different major pieces that we help game studios achieve that enables them to ship huge and highly successful scalable games.
Okay. And so did you start this as an open source company, or did you mentioned that there was some non-open source and you eventually went open source? I'm curious on that.
Yes. So we were part of the Y Combinator summer 2015 batch. So a fair few years ago now. But as part of our, thesis or vision for joining Y Combinator was the pitch that we were going to provide sort of mobile backend as a service. So think Parse or Firebase style capabilities to game developers with that sort of specialist focus on game APIs. APIs that are frankly difficult to express on mobile app tooling like Firebase and when Parse did exist, Parse. Things like leaderboards and matchmaking. They become extremely expressive and therefore complex to query, which tends to make them a bad fit for your more classic mobile backend as a service model. So we pitched to Y Combinator and then later to the industry that we should be providing something specialist within gaming due to some of our backgrounds in working on games for various studios over the years. We thought we could solve this problem with a specialist focus on game tech. And that's where we started. So it was actually not an open source project. It was a software as a service business model. So think Twilio or think SendGrid. It was, get your developer dashboard token, drop it into your SDK, and start making API requests to store your data, play with those APIs.
Avi, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would definitely want to dig into this transition from, the venture-backed model into open source alongside of that. And so I'm curious, at the point when you joined Y Combinator, had you already built out the prototype of the product? Like, where was the product at when you decided to go that route?
Good question. We'd already built out the first version of our game tech, and we had done so as we were an Erlang team. So we'd done so using Erlang and Elixir. This is a few years ago, before Elixir became as popular as it is as a language today. And we built it out using those tools because we knew that we could achieve the kind of scaling model that you need for sort of high velocity social networking style gameplay. And that's what we entered into Y Combinator with. And it wasn't actually at Y Combinator. It was more after that phase of the journey where we were working with game studios. We were talking to them quite extensively. We were, helping them integrate and adopt our technology in not too dissimilar a fashion to the way the team at Parse did it. I know Ilyasuka a little bit from YC. They were also a Y Combinator company from before us, a few years before us. And so we were doing this sort of integration work of that nature to help activate and onboard game teams. But along the way, one of the big questions that kept coming up is, what happens if you guys disappear? What happens to the technology? How do I support my game if this infrastructure becomes unavailable to me for whatever reason? Maybe an acquisition, or maybe, for various other reasons, we pivot into maybe we pivot into being a studio. And we decide to stop distributing the tech. What kind of protections could we provide for the kind of core game data that studios were going to be relying on us for? And that was a really difficult question to answer as a SaaS company, because, you can never rule out wanting to, depending on how you want to grow as a business, you never want to rule out what it might mean for an M&A event, but you don't optimize for an M&A event. And at the same time, you want to make sure that your customers are as safe and protected as possible. So, we approached it with contracts, and we approached it with provisions, protection provisions and things like that. But the frequency within which we heard these kind of concerns, it just became too loud to ignore. And at that point, we had to rethink what we do and how we distribute our tech.
And that brought you to open source specifically, or was there already a established kind of idea that you might want to explore the open source side a little bit more?
Good question. So what happened internally was we spent quite a lot of time soul searching. Okay. How best do we distribute our technology to resolve and appease these kind of concerns and create the kind of breakout developer community success that really was us wanting to emulate Parse, actually, because they have, even to this day, I still hear developers talking about how beautiful that developer experience was. So we still strive to achieve that together at Heroic. And we looked at the market and we realized that our particular set of technologies were better positioned as what I tend to refer to as the core infrastructure category of tech. And I use the word core infrastructure because it lives such at the heart of a business that you need to be able to depend on it in a way that you depend on database technology, right? And if you look at database companies over the last decade, I can't think of, maybe Foundation DB is the only exception, but almost all of them are these days distributed through some kind of open source, open core business model. And so that really was the motivation for us to pivot direction, but not pivot the capability set or the feature set of our technology, but really pivot the distribution model. Now, while doing that, we actually chose to rewrite the technology as well. The motivation for that was I'd previously worked at a database company called Basher Technologies that built a database engine called Riak. And Riak was written in Erlang. And without wanting to be disheartening to the Erlang community, it's a very small developer community, right? So the scope for contributions is quite small. It's a very, very powerful community, very dedicated community, but we wanted to release our technology to a wider pool of potential contributors as well as adopters. And so we rewrote the technology from Erlang into Go, into Google's Go programming language.
Okay, so when you did that, when you started that process, was it the idea that the commercial side would still be as a service, and then there would be this open source version that people could use? Is that how the monetization model was set up?
Good question. So we looked at the existing open source business models, and I think there are only really 4 that I'm aware of that are strong and I would say well-trodden. I don't know if they're well-proven, but well-trodden ground at this stage. The first one is the kind of poster child for all of this. It's your Red Hat support model. All right. I mean, if you talk to anyone that talks about open source and commercializing open source, somewhere the support model around Red Hat comes up as an example, as a reference example. So Red Hat and the support model is one of them. The second one is the managed service model. If you look at every database company today, Elasticsearch bought Found.no, MongoDB built MongoDB Atlas. At some point you build a managed service around your core tech because there is a large portion, especially when the complexity of the technology is high, there's a large portion of developers that just don't want to operationalize it themselves. So you get that managed service model, and we have that today in what we call our Heroic Cloud. But that's the second commercialization avenue. A third one tends to be somewhat consulting heavy. Ruby on Rails has built a fantastic ecosystem of partners and consulting companies and digital agencies who have built their entire revenue generation model around leveraging that technology, contributing back to it, but using, Django is very similar to build these ecosystems that allow you to create sort of a revenue outcome and still be open source. That's the third one that I know that we've seen working quite well in the market. And the fourth one is a split between licensing and open source. So you hold some set of capabilities back, and it could be a dashboard, it could be enhanced monitoring, it could be a bunch of tooling for the enterprise to do with SOC 2 compliance and COPA compliance and things like that. And it could be any of those things, but they are things that the larger organizations are inevitably going to need to be able to sign off on this technology use internally, and they want a commercial entity behind it that they can work with. So those are the 4 that I'm aware of, guys. It's what we call now the open core model. I think Open Source Software Capital call it COSS, commercialized open source software. But it's what we call open core. Yeah.
And so are you pursuing all of those, or I know you have a Heroic Cloud.
We actually, yes, we have ended up enabling, because of the wide spectrum of different requirements and integration challenges within the games industry, we have ended up adopting, I guess, at least 3 of those, really. So we don't really do much consulting. We're a product company. So we don't really do much of the professional services side of things. But we have a managed service for studios that don't want to operationalize the tech. They don't want to manage databases. They don't want to, run containers or think about any of those challenges. We have a support model for when you're in production and you need hot fixes. You want feature requests that you want us to prioritize. Because you're a customer coming in to support the company. And then thirdly, we have a licensing model for the clustering technology we provide, which sits outside of the core code base, that runs as kind of a layer underneath it to allow the player base to span multiple servers for a bunch of different game features: multiplayer, chat messaging, status events, in-app notifications, matchmaking, a whole bunch of the functionality of our game tech. You want your player base not to be sharded. So to avoid that very traditional, World of Warcraft style realm server pattern, and move into a singular player base at scale, we provide that clustering tech. Again, not too dissimilar from database technology to allow you to do that. And so wherever you're connected across whichever server in your Nakama cluster, you're playing against any other player who's in the game.
So this sounds very similar, I think, to a lot of companies that we talk to in the open source space, where I think, those 4 categories that you mentioned. We lost Gabe.
I think connectivity. I think he'll be back.
Yeah. So of those 4 categories, I think that, offering a variety of them kind of covers a lot of the bases. And then you have something for most of the customers that are going to come your way. But I think a lot of the companies that we talk to, there's kind of one of those models that's kind of the main act. And then you have the others, which get the other customers. And so I'm curious, does one of those models make up the vast majority of the company's revenue, or how do you see those different offerings fitting together in terms of your bottom line?
For us, it's definitely got to be sort of the support piece. It's I'm going into production. I want to be able to speak to the makers of Nakama, which is the name of our game tech. I want to speak to the Heroic team where I need them. I don't prefer to liken it to an insurance package, but you could think of it that way, right?
Definitely.
In the same way as, Basho with Riak and in other database companies like the guys working on MongoDB and Redis, when it's in production, you want to know that if there's an issue, there's somebody you can call. So I think that's where the lion's share of the relationships with game studios comes from today.
Yeah, it's an interesting shift in paradigm, because a lot of companies are trying to chase the cloud as a cloud first, but I don't think the revenues outside of the big players like the Mongo Atlas or the AWSs, right? I don't think that their revenues are necessarily as high or as growing as fast as potentially they could get from a few larger of the enterprise customers. And I've seen that quite a few people in chasing that cloud had even gone so far as to say, we're not going to offer any of those other options, right? We're not going to do
support license
or a cost, we're not going to do open core. We're just going to go, either you do the cloud and you pay us, or you're on your own with the open source and deal with it. And that's a tough situation for a lot of people.
You're right. I mean, I know that, one other product out there that I'm a huge fan of are the guys at Sentry. And they provide that, stack trace and logging capture on mobile devices, on end devices that can be centralized for analysis through their dashboard. And they, I think, have taken very much the route that you're talking about here, where it's open source technology. They have a managed service. Those are your options. Run it yourself somewhere or work with their managed service. And so I've seen that in a few places. We find, again, this is probably games industry specific, but we find a lot of studios need to integrate game tech with business intelligence toolings, analytic stacks, maybe a data lake like Snowflake or Redshift or something like that. And so we end up needing to not always be able to manage to just host it for them and running on our infrastructure, because the connectivity is just not possible to do through VPC and some of the private peering that would need to happen. So instead, it becomes more effective to place it into their AWS account or GCP or similar. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting, point, because I've seen that a lot as well, where and it's not just in gaming. When you talk about either regulated industries have this issue, where you can't necessarily have everything in the same VPC. And so the as a service plays from multiple providers causes issues. So they want to roll their own, even if it is in their own cloud provider or in the cloud provider of choice. Or that they want to keep control of that stack fully because they, want to ensure that they have all the security and, all the bells and whistles and all the, ability to do any sort of analytics or operations that they need on it directly. So it's a common thing.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. You're right. I'm been in the industry, games industry, focused for 7 years, so I come at everything from the mindset of how best to kind of serve that industry. But you're right. There's a lot of other areas where, being able to deploy the technology as a product rather than just a service can make a big difference for possible enterprise adopters of that tech.
So you followed a very different pathway than a lot of other companies that we've talked to in the past, where you started commercial, went open source, as opposed to you start off open source and then eventually might add commercial offerings. Was it kind of a shock to some of the employees or the people you're working with on a day-to-day basis when all of a sudden you're going from, we're selling this proprietary commercial software, to it's open source? How did that go off internally?
So remember I mentioned that we deliberated over it for about 4 months.
Yeah.
We solicited feedback from everyone on the team. And we, took the opinions of the guys working on the sales side, marketing, everyone on core engineering. Is this the right direction to take? We know that we believe we fit this category of core infrastructure. Looking at the space that appears to be, the open source route appears to be the best way to solve the needs of our specific target developer audience, but also, resolve the concerns they have around the availability of the technology in the event of some kind of change of circumstance, right? It seemed like the best way to answer that concern. And so we deliberated about it for quite a while, probably in hindsight, a lot longer than we needed to. Because
Isn't that always great. The case?
Yeah. It's been great. If I could turn back time and leverage hindsight to change direction, I would have just taken this route from the start. But probably leaned in earlier into just building it as an open source project and then forming some kind of commercial entity around it later. So that's what I would do if I could have gone back. Yeah.
So when you were going over this internally, I guess a two-pronged question. One is, was this something that you had any trouble or difficulty kind of getting your investors on board with? And then B, I'm curious, if you had done that from the start, how do you think that would have impacted that initial, getting into YC, getting that initial first, pre-seed or seed funding? How do you think that open source question would tie into
So
that?
I'm not sure Y Combinator would ever have been concerned about whether we, started off through a software as a service distribution model or a product orientated open source model. They want the founders to believe that they can find a way to make it work and build something that people love, right? So I think the distribution model is less concerned. I mean, obviously alongside distribution comes in eventual monetization and revenue generation, commercialization. But for them, it's all about, enabling the founders to have the conviction and the freedom to find whatever that right path might be, whether it's a pivot, whether it would be described as a pivot or not. In our case, I wouldn't necessarily call our move from SaaS to open source a pivot, but depending on how you think about the definition, you very well could at the end of the day, right? So that answers, I think, half of it. As far as the rest of our investors go, they were prepared to follow Y Combinator's lead. So in that respect, it was quite easy, quite straightforward for us to be able to change, because I think we started thinking early about that line between what is open source and what is open core. Okay, so we started early enough, and I think you see sometimes in the open source space at the moment, I don't know if you guys saw what happened just this week or last tail end of last week with Akka framework.
Oh yes.
So that's what happens. Perhaps if I could just give my humble opinion on this, what happens when perhaps very, very much later in the life cycle of open source, you try to move the line in the sand between what is a commercializable relationship and what is a community relationship. And we thought very, very early, because we started off fully proprietary and then shifted, we thought very early, what is the right place to draw that line? So, yeah.
Yeah. And Chris, that's a great example. Avi and I just debated that like yesterday. Honestly, we did. Yeah. So it's a very timely example for sure. But it is an interesting take because I think that the mentality from a lot of startups, especially in the open source space, is grow at all costs, because we all know as soon as you do your first push to GitHub, you're going to have 1 million users, right? That just happens. That's what open source is all about. Mm-hmm. But
if it's a GitHub project that's JavaScript based, you probably will.
maybe, right? But I think that growth at all cost mentality. And we're going to not worry about any sort of the commercial aspects of it, any sort of like, we'll figure out the monetization later, or, we'll bolt on something later. It tends to drive some of those later changes, because all of a sudden, hey, maybe you've gone through a few rounds of investment and now you need to start to show some ROI. And maybe, your early indicators were growth. And now you're left with, maybe some pitfalls in the revenue and the profitability side of things.
I think you're right. I mean, I would argue, and again, just one person's thought on this in the space, that a lot of that kind of adoption at all costs, especially when it comes to the venture capitalist mindset behind it, was driven by this, I don't know if you'd call it third generation of tech company, but let's call it roughly third generation. The rise of Facebook, the rise of social networking, the rise of the kind of companies that go through free consumer adoption and then figure out how to monetize later. Mm-hmm. And it worked exceptionally well in those spaces because you as an individual became the product. You became the advertising data that was needed to drive revenue, right? Now, with B2B, I don't know that there's really that strong a correlation between adoption and then later commercialization. Obviously, you want the project to be popular because you can prove product market fit. But how strongly that then ties to the commercializability of the audience that you have captured, I think becomes a lot trickier. And so maybe it's to do with the freedom that venture capitalism has given to, a particular generation of open source companies that is focused entirely on adoption, and then, maybe, as you say, 2, 3, 4 rounds of funding later are then trying to think about, well, we have this really strong developer audience, but what do we do to actually commercialize the businesses that that developer is operating with this technology within? So that's where I think some of this comes from anyway. I mean, there's also the aspect that open source has always been a freedom of expression, a space for developers to just gift to the world something that is of their creation. Because at the end of the day, we're all creators. And so we want, it's an element of showing off our skills. It's an element of scratching our own itch. It's an element of being able to, entertain a community of developers and give them something to rally behind. Yeah. And that's also driven a lot of philosophy around open source. But that has actually created a counterintuitive positioning when you've got the generation of commercialized open source software coming through. And so developers feel like that rug is being pulled out from underneath them. And it seemed unexpected.
Well, I think that... Yeah, go on. Let me jump in real quick there, because I think that's an interesting point from that kind of B2B versus B2C play, because and even Gabe in the DevRel space might know this. I'm interested in his take as well, because when you talk about like the developer journey, right now a lot of these tech companies and these software companies that are out there in this space. And let's use infrastructure companies. You mentioned database companies as a good example. I have a deep background in the database space. Everyone is chasing the developer, because the idea is if I can get 1 million developers and I can get them to use maybe our free cloud product or sign up to use this thing, then they're going to build these applications. And then eventually they'll need support because their bosses will be like, oh my God, this is great, but why did you build it on this stuff that was absolutely free? And then they'll have to pay for the cloud, right? That's kind of the model if you're thinking about the business model from the mass adoption standpoint. So if I can get 1 million people from a developer perspective, then if I can convert 10,000 of them into paying customers, that's a win. So growing that, individual user audience makes a lot of sense. And the conversion rates don't always work that way because a lot of developers, they're just using these as free products and they don't see the value in paying for them.
I would weigh in here, but I'm going to pass it to Gabe.
You can weigh in here too, Chris, but Gabe, Chris, either one.
Sure. I can definitely echo that sentiment for the developer community, but our efforts absolutely follow that approach. At least my focus is primarily on independent developers, small solo projects, because that's kind of one tagline that has followed Heroic and Nakama from the onset, is kind of democratizing game development to the point that you don't need a large studio backer. So yes, I will take 1 million individual developers versus perhaps one large enterprise, because at this point in time, a successful game can come from anywhere. It can be one single person developing the next hugely successful game. And as that game grows, so does their need for our product, and so does the recognition for our product. So yes, I'm all for that model.
Awesome. And Chris, you had a comment there?
Yeah, no, I would echo. I mean, we have this expression internally. It's maybe a bit cheesy. We provide our game tech without feature gating it, specifically because we believe that a rising tide lifts all boats. Right? If you look at the change in expectation from players as they play increasingly higher fidelity, higher quality, more immersive, more social, more competitive games, the cost and energy required to produce that output for success that meets the expectation of players. I mean, let's talk about the Fortnite and the Roblox experiences that players are accustomed to now. That gets increasingly more difficult to achieve on a small team. Mm-hmm. You're not just talking about the involvement with art style and game design, economy modeling, physics engines, rendering engines, domain modeling. Then you've got all of the server-side stuff. And so for us, we're absolutely passionate about the fact that, we can provide tech that, some of the largest games publishers in the world are using. And, you consolidate that down to a single server deployment model, and any game team in the world can use it. Any independent developer in the world can use it. And they're using exactly the same features and capabilities that the largest publishers in the space that we work with are using today. So, we're proud of that, definitely.
And I think that, with this wide scale adoption, it brings the challenge of everybody downloading, using the software. How do you then start to figure out whether the company's growing? What sort of things are you looking for to see if you are, rising the tide, making the pie bigger for everyone? Like, what sort of key business metrics are you using to drive, that discussion and start to plan out for the future?
Gabe, I'll leave this one to you. I think you've got all the metrics and tracking.
Right, sure. Obviously, there's a differentiation in metrics between the growth of revenue in terms of obviously enterprises signed up, managed cloud services, and just pure adoption. From my point of view, on the DevRel side, I follow pure adoption. I'm not focused on how many users there are in our managed service. I'm not focused on the number of studios that we have as users. I'm focused purely, the number one thing we look at is Docker downloads, just the number of individual people. Doesn't matter if they're working at Zynga or Sony, or if they're working in their garage at night. So for me, that's one and the same. The focus is purely on adoption with the belief, and I think that's shared across the company, that will eventually lead to the commercial growth as well.
Yeah. So I think Docker downloads is our number one. I know it's difficult to truly determine the unique users because obviously a Docker download is counted also when you're updating for new releases of the server. But, we sit at about 5.3 million Docker downloads at this point. So we're proud of that number as a measure of reach into our developer community. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think that, getting that adoption number and focusing on what it is, everybody, hopefully, if you're running a business, you can track your revenue, you can track your sales, right? Those are important, things that everybody can track. But the predictive measure, especially in this modern kind of business ecosystem, and when you're in the open source space, is adoption. And the open source adoption side of things is that predictive measure that used to be, kind of the marketing funnel, right? It's the top of the marketing funnel, or of what used to be that marketing funnel, because the more people you have, the more opportunities to potentially, engage with someone in a commercial relationship later on down the road.
It's absolutely that marketing reach. Definitely. Yeah. Almost entirely, I would say, for the most part, substitutes what would otherwise be considered KPIs for marketing teams. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think, Avi, this is one of the things that we've seen quite a bit as well in talking with users is, in the open source space, the marketing side is different, right? It's not the same, marketing process, because you can't gate things. You talked about feature gating, Chris, but, marketing play often is, we're going to gate our content. We're going to gate our downloads. You have to sign up. You have to register. You have to tell us everything about you before you can use it. And that's just very anti-open source.
It absolutely is. Yeah. We don't have any really deeply valuable telemetry at all of any kind inside the game server when you download it and you run it. We don't really believe in that as a way of measuring reach. It seems a little bit privacy invasive for the developer. So yeah, we're unlike some, I guess, node projects. There are certainly some node projects that they give you the option to opt in or opt out of these sort of anonymous tracking type things. But we tried to keep it a slightly looser measure. We obviously use Scarf to help us with these things, but it's a looser figure around download counts and using that as a measure of adoption and a measure of reach. The industry as a whole, we tend to think of it. Unity engine is not open source; it's a closed source engine, but it is free to download and use. So there is a little bit of more proprietary and licensing orientated nature in the games industry than perhaps other industries from an adoption perspective. But Unity have a reach of maybe about 8 million, I think was the last time I read somewhere. It was about 8 or 9 million developers. Unreal Engine is somewhere in the sort of 5 to 6 million developers. Again, it's also not open source. It's a closed source engine, but it's source available if you pay to become part of the Unreal Developer Network. And so that's kind of our idea of where we want to get to in terms of reach. If we think about our market opportunity and our market reach, we want to be able to say every one of those developers knows about Nakama, knows about our game tech.
Yeah, I think that's very apt about the the move to focus more on the distribution line than having kind of very deeply ingrained telemetry. That was something that we have actually at Scarf seen over and over, that people are much more sensitive to phoning home mechanisms and kind of baked in telemetry into the code that they are using, rather than, say the if I download something from Docker, that registry is just going to see something. That is how the internet works. And, I'm used to that. And we find that fitting into people's expectations is a very key thing here. And so, I'm hoping that we will, see more innovations in this distribution channel observability, I think, overall. And it seems like that is the general shift, or the general direction. a lot of this stuff is going.
It's about acceptability. I think you're right. I think it's about the personal feeling that developers have, because we tend to be more acutely aware of how data is used or misused from a privacy perspective.
Right.
And so, with that acute awareness, it's a much more acceptable route for open source companies who want to analyze their reach and their success, using adoption as a measure of success, to be able to do that. It's a much more acceptable way to do it, I think.
Yeah. Matt, go ahead.
Oh, no, Avi, if you have more questions, feel free.
I guess, one thing that I've been hearing more and more about broadly these days is just an increasingly positive sentiment about open source from the gaming industry. I was at the Open Source Summit in Austin a few months back, and they were talking about the new Open 3D Foundation and talking about all the different kind of, gaming companies, or, even in the film industry, just entertainment broadly, I would say that are seeing an increase in open source participation. And, maybe that's more just I'm happening to see that now. Maybe that's a genuine increase in general participation. And so I'm really curious, as someone who has been working in the gaming industry for several years now, how you've been looking at that trend. Is that something is that genuinely what you are seeing as well? Why is this happening now? I'm just curious for your general thoughts on that trend broadly.
So that's a really great question. So my opinion on this is, I think you're absolutely right. I think the games industry as a market, that you reach through game tech, is becoming much more amenable and open to the idea of open source technology. And this, perhaps the reason that this segment of the developer space has maybe operated as slightly more of a laggard than other developer communities in say, social media and, app frameworks and, web development and areas like that. Maybe the reasoning for the difference is that there was much stronger sense of in-house development of tooling as a form of competitive advantage in gaming. So if you go back, say, 10 years, Unity Engine was very early in its life cycle. Now, it's not open source, but let's talk about it anyway. It was very early, and it was almost disparaged by a lot of the games industry as a hobbyist engine, as an indie developer engine. It didn't, at that point, necessarily have the physics capabilities and the rendering engine to compete with a lot of the in-house engines that had been developed at studios. But over time, the industry realized that actually, yes, there are some circumstances where I need to specialize in building that might warrant the building of my own engine and the building of my own physics toolchain and my own rendering systems. But, as Unity Engine became more capable in those areas, it also became a more standardized approach to solving these problems, less uptake as a developer moving between one studio and another. It meant that it became much more widely adopted. And I think open source is the next phase of that, where, there's some amount of standardization of tooling that can help the transference of knowledge by developers, or the leveraging of knowledge by developers, working on games from one studio to the next. Less internal proprietary tooling that needs to be maintained. Again, and I think it also sits alongside that trend of expectation from players. If a studio starts up today, if you look at the Unreal Engine 5 demo, for example, the physics and the rendering and the just the quality of collision detection, of destructible physics, of ray tracing, of all of the aspects that go into what looks like such a beautiful demo. I mean, that's 25 years worth of engineering effort. And being a studio today, do you really want to invest in that area from scratch to try to catch up? And so, you're looking to find tools that can help you achieve that much, much earlier so that you can compete with the rest of the industry, building different gameplay experiences to attract audiences that expect Fortnite, quality of gameplay experience. Now, where does open source fit into this? So companies like Godot Engine, well, actually they're non-profit foundations like Godot and the Godot Engine, those guys are a lighthouse, actually. I mean, they've been building as open source code for a long time, at least 10, maybe 12, 15 years. I'd need to double check, to be honest. But they're a lighthouse for other open source companies, including us, where we've been inspired by the level of commitment and perseverance and attention to building a developer community inside the games industry through an open source model. But as you see, there's starting to be an acceleration of that. You've got what was the Crytek engine that got bought by Amazon and turned into Lumberyard, that has now been spun out of Amazon, donated to the Linux Foundation, or maybe the Software Freedom Conservancy, that is now Open3D Engine, that you mentioned at this conference, this Open Source Software Summit that had just happened. And that's, because we're moving more towards it's acceptable to not build these proprietary tools internally, to leverage the maturity of what is out there in the open source space and then build on top of it and utilize it to catch up and compete with the very best of what is being built on console, desktop, web, and mobile today. So I think that's a very elaborate answer, but I hope that did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a similar thing. People say don't roll your own cryptography. I think there's like a hard tech. I think will over time gravitate towards these things of like these are not problems that we need to solve ourselves. You're really going to be reinventing the wheel if you do. And I think, game engines, real-time computing, like massively parallelized and distributed compute, like these are all very hard problems to build. And so I think, that this is not a surprising trend, I think.
I agree with you, definitely.
Overall. Yeah.
But the industry has, where they didn't build internally, they were accustomed to licensing, right? Havoc Physics, for example, it's a classic example. There are all sorts of sound libraries out there with proprietary codecs that have been licensed for years and years and years by studio teams as part of their tool chain. So I think the industry was just accustomed for a much, much longer period of time to go through that licensing model. And that licensing model is sort of shifting to open source adoption and then commercialization through that commercial licensing relationship as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think that, it just speaks to the power of open source, right? And, you see this as, while open source, the tools that are released might not initially be up to snuff with the other ones that have been around or the other proprietary tools that have been around for 20 years, the bar gets shorter and shorter, or the gap gets shorter and shorter over every release. And open source eventually, brings a multitude of people to contribute and starts to close that gap super quick.
Absolutely. I mean, Blender, right? Blender is a tool for 3D and 2D asset creation, and the way it competes with, Maya and, and other tooling now, it's just as competitive or more so than ever before. Yeah.
Well, Chris, Gabe, thank you for hanging out with us today, telling us a little bit about, what's going on over at Heroic Labs and telling us a little bit about your own open source journey. It's been very enlightening.
Thank you so much, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you as well, guys. Thanks for the time.
All right. Thanks.